So, this week we're talking about refugees and asylum seekers in Australia, and directly references Article 14 of the UDHR. Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Firstly, I'm going to start off with the definition of refugees. A refugee is somebody who has been forced to escape their country due to persecution. An asylum seeker is somebody who has asked for residence in a country on a refugee basis, so they're saying they're a refugee. A migrant, on the other hand, is someone who has made a choice to go to another country. They have the freedom to go back to the country if they want to, without being persecuted. A refugee does not have that luxury. Now, refugee status can be claimed under certain grounds. You can seek refugee status if you are being persecuted on the basis of your religion, if you are being persecuted on the basis of your nationality, if you are being persecuted because of your membership of a particular social group, if you're being persecuted because of race, and if you are being persecuted because of your political opinion. These are the main grounds that people seek refugee status in a country. It means because of their religion, nationality, membership of a social group, their race or political opinion, if they return to their country of origin, they would not be safe. They might be subject to physical persecution, they might be jailed, they might be killed. Now, Australia has signed, obviously, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we also have other obligations to refugees through other international covenants that we have signed. So, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. These conventions also include the right not to be imprisoned arbitrarily, which means by signing these conventions we made a commitment that we would not put people in prison if they had not committed a crime. Unfortunately, Australia has breached that particular article of the conventions. The Australian government argue that this is because of national interest and security. One of the most controversial aspects of the Australian government's refugee policy has been their attitude towards people who arrive in Australia by boat. Now, Australia, if a person arrives in Australia by plane on a valid visa and that visa expires, for example, if you arrive on a student visa by plane and your visa expires and then you then claim asylum on the basis of being a refugee, the government will process your application whilst you live in the community or whilst you are in a detention centre within Australia. However, if you arrive in Australia by boat, your application for asylum will be processed offshore in a detention centre in either Nauru or Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, or in a new detention centre in Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. This all started out from the children overboard situation under the John Howard government, where footage was shown to the Australian public of desperate asylum seekers in the middle of the ocean throwing their children overboard, or apparently. Unfortunately, the footage was not actually true footage. However, on the basis of this, it gave rise to an atmosphere of fear of people who are arriving in Australia by boats. So the government, successive Liberal governments, have brought in policies that discriminated against people arriving in Australia by boat. And Labor Party governments have also maintained the Liberal Party policies because they were so politically popular. So in these policies, if you arrived by boat as a refugee on one of those leaky boats. From August 2012, all arrivals by boat were processed offshore in Nauru or Manus Island, which meant that people were put into detention centres in those places. And from July 2013, it was decided that nobody who arrived in Australia by boat can be settled in Australia, even if they are determined to be a genuine refugee. So what happened was any person who arrived by boat, they were imprisoned for an indeterminate amount of time, and they were never allowed to come get settled in Australia. They were settled in either Nauru or in Papua New Guinea. Now, thousands of people have arrived in Australia by boat since 2012, since these laws were brought in, and most of them were imprisoned in Papua New Guinea and Nauru. About 80% of them were determined to be genuine refugees, but they were still left in PNG and Nauru. Currently, the numbers have been reduced greatly because the Australian government came to a deal with the United States government to essentially settle many of the people who were in Papua New Guinea and Nauru and to settle them in the United States. So at the moment, from the 31st of July 2020, there's 181 people in detention centres in Papua New Guinea. There's 180 in Nauru. 65 from Papua New Guinea are non-refugees, while 21 in Nauru are not determined to be refugees. 26 are still in the process of determination. And in PNG, 116 were determined to be refugees and 133 in Nauru were determined to be refugees. However, none of those people will be allowed to come to Australia. So there are a couple of arguments about keeping people in offshore detention centres. One of the arguments is that refugees coming to Australia by boat are actually economic migrants rather than refugees. However, as I said before, about 80% of people who have arrived by boat so far have been determined to be genuine refugees and people who would be subject to persecution if they were returned to their own country. Also, the percentage of people who arrive by boat who are determined to be genuine refugees is much, much higher than the number of people determined to be genuine refugees who arrive by aeroplane. So there's a difference there. Another argument is that if you let people come into the community, it costs the community, Australian community, more to maintain an asylum seeker in the community. But as can be seen by the figures here, to keep a person in offshore processing, this is the budget for 2019-20, it's $25 billion a year to maintain those detention centres, whereas processing a person in the community costs only $10,000 a year. And basically, the difference in cost is just enormous. These figures actually come from the government's own figures, budget figures. So you can see the difference there. That's not really a good argument. Australia's record on refugee settlement has been slammed by the UN a lot. And the latest person to say something against Australia was the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who came here and made some certain statements about Australia and our treatment of refugees. And if you want to look at that link, you can have a look at that link there to see what she says. One of the biggest scandals in Australian refugee policy was the imprisonment of children in detention centres. This Four Corners documentary on the children of Nauru is a couple of years old now. Currently there are no children on Manus or in Papua New Guinea, but there are 4 children held in detention on Christmas Island. Scott Morrison is a very big fan of offshore detention, and there has been talk that the coalition government do want to reopen our offshore detention centres and start using them a bit more. However, in 2019, there was Australian Parliament passed what's called the Medivac Bill, which evacuated many children who were suffering from medical conditions from Manus and Papua New Guinea into Australia. But that bill only lasted about 6 months when it was repealed by the same Australian government. I recommend that you look at this documentary, but it can be quite distressing because it has images of children self-harming and talking about their depression they suffered. But it's certainly an eye-opener, and I recommend you have a look at it. So the Australian refugee policy is quite controversial, and there are arguments for and against our current policy of settling boat arrivals offshore. The arguments in favour of it is that people say that refugees who arrive by boat are economic migrants and not refugees. There's the argument that they take up resources that could be used by Australian citizens and that they are jumping the queue. These are the arguments that the Liberal Party and the Labor Party have both used to maintain our current system of offshore processing of refugees. The arguments against the Australian refugee policy are that the policy breaches numerous human rights obligations that we have, including the right for people not to be arbitrarily put into detention. It is cheaper to process people on Australian soil rather than offshore, and it's also more humane because they have access to high quality healthcare and psychological care. And another argument against the queue, well, there really is no queue because migration and refugee applications are completely different processes with completely different quotas. And of course, there's a discrimination against people who arrive by plane, can process completely differently than people who arrive by boat. So I'll leave it up to you. It's a very controversial issue and very political, and you'll certainly be hearing more about it once we get close to federal election time. That's it for me for today. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and may have learned something. See you next week.